Hello and welcome to an episode of Atomic Vinyl Reviews. My name's Jacob, and today we are talking about a little bit of a controversial discussion, or at least, people have very mixed opinions on this sort of stuff, and that is CGI versus practical effects in Godzilla movies. Now, the reason I bring this up is because I saw a post the other day on one of the Facebook Godzilla fan groups about the future of the franchise and what do people prefer, CGI or practical effects. These kind of posts come up every once in a while on these groups, and the interesting thing which I found with this particular post and some in recent years was that the leaning tends to be ever more going towards CGI, which I have various mixed opinions on. So, back in the day, the posts were definitely overwhelmingly in favor of practical effects, with, the outlier being CGI. These days, it goes so far as to some people say they can't bear to watch these pseudomation films, which, for those people, I actually genuinely feel sorry for them. I don't know what else to say about that, but yeah, that's really limiting great films that you're not going to be able to enjoy because of that preference. So I do feel sorry for them in that regard. But to the topic at hand, so let me start off by saying that, I obviously lean very strongly in the direction of practical effects and pseudomation. I absolutely adore practical effects. I adore any sort of art form and filmmaking that involves, the physical objects in front of the camera being filmed. Even with animation, I absolutely adore 2D hand-drawn animation and stop-motion animation. Like, if you guys have seen any of those Leica Studios films, the animation in those is amazing, and the way they're pushing that. And my response to this was that I have nothing against CGI. It's its own sort of aesthetic thing, but I really, really want to see practical effects be pushed as far as they can, and to be done in the genre of kaiju filmmaking. So we're just zooming ahead technologically in recent years, and definitely I believe that we could get some amazing looking practical effects with these modern technologies. However, since the industry has very much changed and is leaning in favor of using CGI for, I can totally see why they're doing that for a number of reasons. Much like the same way as instead of making things out of wood or metal, practically everything these days is made out of plastic, because, it's a great versatile material. You can do so much with it. Those different materials have their own unique characteristics, which, a lot of stuff is lacking in, for example. And the same, I feel, sort of applies to the use of CGI in films. I think that in a world where it is so prevalent and used in all these films, like I said, I understand completely why it is, but there's a real lack of practical effect-driven cinema these days, especially in high-budget movies, and that's a real shame to me, because I genuinely know that if these studios wanted, they have the resources, and if they wanted to push this medium, they could make something visually stunning using just practical effects. I think that in itself would be genuinely worthwhile. Now, we have definitely got some great practical effects in kaiju filmmaking over the years. Look back particularly at something like the Gamera series from the 90s of films, and that had some amazing use of miniatures and practical effects. Plenty of that stuff evident throughout the Godzilla series, of course. But since, the last fully practical Godzilla film was, when I say fully practical, I mean, of course there was CGI in it, but the last one was Final Wars, of course, and that was a very long time ago now. Technology evolves so rapidly every year now. In that time, there's so much more that we could do. The little electronics that could be used to make, the puppetry in various suits, and the detail that you can do to mass produce, miniature cities, and all the camera tricks and the lighting stuff, and all the little miniature tanks and all that sort of stuff, and the technology that can be used to animate those things, as well as compositing images of actual people running around through that, and all that sort of stuff. All of that, imagine how far that could be pushed in this modern day. And now I know what a lot of you guys think. The people who lean towards CGI. One of the main things that they say is you can add more details to stuff and make more sort of finer movements, and you can make stuff look more photorealistic. But this whole sort of argument about realism, I feel, is almost secondary to this. Yes, you can definitely make CGI look pretty much absolutely real these days. Absolutely, we've seen that in films like the Dawn of the Planet of the Apes series, and the suits that they use in the Marvel films, like for example the Iron Man suit and some just other random elements that you wouldn't even notice CGI in some of these recent Marvel movies, are just so spot on that you couldn't tell. However, with something like practical effects, the argument a lot of the people who prefer practical effects make isn't just that it looks more real, although for a lot of cases that is the case, because, for example, these CGI things that look so marvelous and real, this is the top tier CGI we're talking about. This stuff is very expensive, very time consuming, and very talented people have to work on it. But with a lot of sort of the more middle range, lower budget, sort of B-movie-ish type stuff that's coming out, CGI looks garbage. Absolutely garbage. With CGI, the rate of realism, it has diminishing returns depending on how good it is. So you can have something that's really top tier and that looks amazing, but the moment you start to lower how well it's made just ever so slightly, it begins to very quickly go into, yeah, that looks completely fake. There's a very fine line with CGI, whereas with practical effects you find that curve to be a little bit more straight. Bad CGI looks a lot worse than bad practical effects, and for the simple fact that with practical effects, even if something doesn't look, real, like a real animal or something like that, it will always look like something physical, real in front of the camera, because that's exactly what it is. With the exception of that weird puppet thing that they did in Alien 3, that was just poor compositing with the lighting and stuff like that. But, if you're not compositing anything, having like a practical suit in something will always look a lot more convincing than a cheap CGI thing. And it's not even about whether it looks real or not. Like I say, it's the aesthetic of practical effects that a lot of people genuinely love. A really cool analogy that I thought of was, it's the same reason that if you compare a photograph portrait compared to a painting, obviously the photograph is going to be photorealistic for, like no shit. But even if the painting is very impressionistic, like you can tell it wasn't done to a standard of photorealism, that in itself is appealing and that has value, and there are so many different aesthetics that you can do with that. And it's very similar with CGI versus practical effects. A big part of that is there's a perceived physicality of the painting or the practical effect that people genuinely love and enjoy. It's a different aesthetic, it's a different vibe watching a movie. And like I said, in a market where we're saturated with CGI films, I feel generally a bit sad that we don't see more practical effects being really taken advantage of, because when they are, even when they're, melded well with a lot of CGI where you can't tell, it really stands out. Like, the Mad Max Fury Road film, for example, you could tell that a lot of that stuff was done practically, and it really showed compared to a lot of films. Now, yes, there was a lot of CGI integrated in that, but it was integrated well, and the practical effects were allowed to shine through. Whereas something like Jurassic World, for example, those series, made practical effects dinosaurs, but they used the CGI very poorly, and they covered the dinosaurs up and animated over the top of them, and God knows why they did it, because it made them look shitty. And then we come to the Godzilla films. I have no problem with the monsters, and I have problems with 2014, but less so with the animation, but more so with other stuff. But it's like a recurring theme on this channel. I'm sorry for you people that love 2014. It always comes up. But I have no problem with those films existing. I really loved King of the Monsters, and I enjoyed it, and I think, you know, using the CGI had definite benefits in that. Like, it made this sort of vast, expansive world much easier to create, and I really loved, for example, the way they use motion capture and were able to add personality to the creatures, for example, King Ghidorah and those little interactions. However, that stuff is possible to do with practical effects. Yes, it will look different, but I think that difference would be a good thing, and it's not to say that I don't enjoy that King of the Monsters exists in the way it is. I wouldn't change it at this point because I love that film. But going forward to completely not have any more practical effects in this series, I think would be genuinely sad. It would really make me feel sad if Toho, for example, decided to go straight for the CGI effects and, you know, in that direction. One example that is kind of interesting, I feel, is Shin Godzilla. Now, Shin Godzilla did use a lot of practical effects, but only for the miniatures and the buildings and the destruction scenes of those, and like the little office scene where Kamata-kun is, you know, going over the top of the building. Those, you know, offices collapsing in the interior shots were all miniatures, and it was all really cool to see the making of. And they did actually make a animatronic of Shin Godzilla for some shots, but it was left out of the movie, and the entire creature was CGI. Now, the interesting thing about Shin Godzilla is, though the animation quality isn't as consistent as a lot of the American films, I think that the animation itself had some of the most convincing shots of, like, any CGI film that I've ever seen, of something looking physical, like it's there. Like, there were shots in that where you could swear that Shin Godzilla was an animatronic. Whereas films like 2014 and King of the Monsters, they try to make the monster, Godzilla, look like a real animal, like a real reptilian kind of thing. Shin Godzilla went in the direction of trying to make the man in a rubber suit look like that was a real monster, if that makes sense. So they animated Shin Godzilla to look like he was rubber. Like, his body was that texture. They had those same sort of movements. And I think that's what really made Shin Godzilla feel like Godzilla. Because part of what makes Godzilla, Godzilla has and will always be the fact that he was a man in a rubber suit. Even down to the 2014 and 2019 designs. Even though I still feel that they're a little bit out of the range of what I feel like necessarily is Godzilla to me, they still are based off that humanoid form. That's, you know, what Godzilla is. And the aesthetic of practical effects is a big part of that as well. Now, they did, like I said, they emulated that with Shin Godzilla in CGI, and I think they did it really well in that film, and that's actually one of the reasons that I just love that film, because they took that approach. Like I said, I just love practical effects. Like, I even love bad practical effects, guys, but just because people just assume that modern audiences would think, oh, that's an old thing, I don't necessarily think that that's a decent enough reason for that aesthetic to die off. I think that we could definitely push it forwards, and even though the CGI is seen as like the modern thing, there's no reason why we can't push practical effects forward, because they do their own thing, and I think it's very legitimate, and there are very good reasons for pushing it forward beyond just nostalgia. Just to add a texture and a flavor to these films that is definitely lacking in the industry. Like I said, I've been swayed to see that, yeah, CGI can look very real, especially if you look at stuff like the Lego movie and some recent advancements that they made with lighting and stuff like that to make it look more natural. It's really coming off very well. There's something just about practical effects that I love. And perhaps they may not still be there with lighting, because here's just another little interesting anecdote that I remember that I wanted to tell you guys. So, if anybody has seen Kubo and the Two Strings, so this is one of those Leica stop-motion animated films. Now, Leica Studios, they make, like, they're pushing stop motion in the modern day, like, to the peak of what it can do. They're using really complicated really tedious, complicated 3D printing technology to basically make all the different facial features and movements of the characters, you know, in each frame in a separate 3D printed plastic little pieces that they actually swap out on their characters to make them move. So they actually do this frame by frame, and they have thousands of these little pieces. They have really elaborate sets. They do really great compositing with their stuff and all of that sort of stuff. So it's like, you know, back in the day, you had stuff like Wallace and Gromit, where it was, you know, the plasticine, which is just a beautiful aesthetic as well. I bloody love those Wallace and Gromit films. Those were top notch. But Leica is like trying to push this stuff as much as possible. And I went into this movie in the cinemas. I didn't know anything about it, actually, before going in. I was aware of Leica films, because, you know, Coraline and all that sort of stuff that I love, but I just didn't pay attention to this film. Me and my girlfriend were like, let's just watch a fun film. We went into this, and we didn't really know anything about it. We were also late, so I couldn't see the Leica Studios logo at the front of the film, so we came in, and it had just started the movie. So I didn't know that it was stop motion. My first reaction when I sat down and started watching it for a couple of minutes was, this is the absolute best CGI animation I have ever seen. Just the lighting was amazing, and I was like, whoa, I didn't know this was possible. And then after a couple of minutes, it hit me. I'm like, oh, this is stop motion, isn't it? And yeah, it was. So I don't know, like I said, I think CGI animation can do, you know, amazing things these days, and be really in that uncanny part of your mind where it looks real, but I still think that actual practical effects, they just have something special, and perhaps they still have that little bit of realism of the lighting and the movement that you just can't or haven't yet got to of CGI, and even if you did, I still think it's still very justifiable, and there's just that aesthetic to practical effects that I really don't want to see die out, and I still want to see pushed in cinema. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. I'd genuinely be really interested to hear what you guys think and your opinions on this, because it's something that's divisive amongst the fan base, and I find it really interesting that the people are shifting, you know, around with their opinions. But I stand firmly on practical effects are something that I love, and I really want to see in the future of this franchise. And, you know, I'm not saying practical effects on their own, although that would be kind of really impressive. But especially if you balance it well with CGI to help integrate the practical effects into the world, and compositing, and all those sort of things like that. For example, how they did it in Mad Max Fury Road, and even going way back to Jurassic Park and all those sort of stuff. So yeah, that's it for this video, guys. Don't forget to like and subscribe and all that good stuff.